The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents The Intrinsic Value of Human Life. So this week I got a handwritten letter, which happens on occasion. Sometimes people will send them to the ACA, 1507 West Koenig Lane, and I really wish that I was the type of person who had the time and the capacity to sit down and write a handwritten response in return. But I just generally feel that it's probably more effective for me to, if the question is something I think is going to be valued, to put it in a video like this so that more people can benefit from it. The letter starts really easily. Matt, I don't know if you get any letters, so I'll keep this short. Do you believe everyone has worth, even those who aren't accomplished and aren't meeting the social expectations of success? I'm constantly questioning my worth or use as it relates to being good enough, but it gets exhausting because I feel I'll never meet anyone's expectations and be exactly what they need me to be. Thank you for your time. The first thing to address with this is this notion of intrinsic value, that something is valuable in and of itself. And it's one of the many areas where religious thought and philosophy and people's fears have led us to kind of misrepresent what value is. And so if I were asked, do you think human life has any intrinsic value? I would say no. But that's not a problem in the slightest. I'm not convinced that anything has any intrinsic value. The very use of the term value implies that there is someone who is imbuing it with value. So basically, this has value because I care about it, because we care about it, because we need it, etc. There's something about us that attributes a value to these things. And to me, this is kind of obvious. Other people seem to struggle. The fear seems to be that, well, if human life has no intrinsic value, then it's all just subjective and relative, and you can come up with excuses for why you should kill these people in order to help out these other people. So we need to have this notion of intrinsic value in human life, that it's sacrosanct. And I could hold up a $1 bill and a $20 bill and point out that fundamentally these are the same, that the paper that they're printed on is the same, the ink is the same. The only thing different is the decoration we put on it, and that decoration is there so that we can tell the difference between the two and fairly trade them. And you have to have copyright or fraud protection sort of devices as well, so that people can't just make a $20 bill, because these are controlled by a government entity. And by the way, they're guaranteed by a government entity to some extent. Now, if you do think that intrinsic value is the thing of primary importance, then I will trade you my $1 bills for your $20 bills as often as you like. You just give me a 20, I'll give you a 1, and we can claim that we're doing a fair trade, because there's no intrinsic value there to worry about. But I think that the reality, we recognize that there are in fact differences in value, and that we don't need an intrinsic value for us to value things differently. When it comes to dealing with people and the sort of expectations that they might have, that is slightly different. This isn't about your intrinsic value. This is about your value to other people. This is about your sense of self-worth, and whether or not it is contingent upon or dictated by other people's view of your worth. Now, I could buy a $1 million car. I couldn't actually, because I don't have the money to do it, but if someone were to give me a car that was worth $1 million, that would be nice. But I would sell it, because I don't need a car that has that kind of value. I'd much prefer the money. So for me, even the $1 million of money has more value than $1 million of car. That's not the same for everybody. And so, yeah, there is some opportunity to talk about value as a purely subjective thing. That said, there's also the fair market value. I have a baseball card that's a 1947 Leaf Jackie Robinson rookie card, and it's in really good condition. I've had it graded. It's in plastic. It is worth some amount of money. The market on them fluctuates depending on supply and demand, depending on the interest of buyers. But does that piece of cardboard have any value in and of itself? I can't find any way to get to the notion that it does. Instead, its value is entirely based on how we value it. And this particular card has greater value than most because it was the first color set of baseball cards after the war. It's Jackie Robinson, it's his rookie card. So it has not only value to baseball card collectors, it has value to African American historical collectors and things like that. But what Jennifer's asking is, I constantly feel like I'm just not valuable to people, or potentially not valuable to people. I'm not going to meet up with their expectations. And that actually doesn't have that much to do with intrinsic value. I just wanted to get that out of the way first because it's one of the most common questions. And when we talk about value, I think we need to be clear that appealing to an intrinsic value does not help us in any way. Recognizing that the relative value, that the subjective values are problematic and can waver is important. For example, I'd love to say, I don't care what people think of me. And I probably have said that before, and in a particular context, it's correct. I'm not overly concerned about people's opinions or assessments of me unless they are someone that I care about, or they can make a case for why their assessment of me is a good thing, is valuable. If somebody says, "Oh, I don't like Matt because he's pro-choice," well, okay, your assessment of my value based on that position, I really don't care that much about, because you haven't established that you have a good criteria. If somebody else says, as happened recently, just the other day, I violated somebody's trust. It was a big deal. It was eye-opening. They called it out and they said, "Hey, you did this thing and I really wish you wouldn't do that because that's a problem." And I thought about it and I recognized, you know what? I was completely in the wrong. And thank you for bringing this to my attention. Your opinion of me matters, not just because you're someone who's incredibly important to me, but also because I agree with the foundation behind your assessment. I agree with you that this was in fact a violation of trust. You making me aware of it allows me to keep that in my mind so that I'm cognizant of a tendency that I might have so that I can potentially avoid doing that in the future. And I'll make every effort to make sure that there's never a potential reason for that person, or hopefully anybody else, to distrust me in any way. Those are valuable lessons we learn that have to do with how we interact with people and how we're perceived by people. Not only is the lie of, if there's no intrinsic value, we're all going to hell in a handbasket common, but so is the lie that your value is wholly or mostly based on what other people think of you. And this is the thing that she's basically writing in on. There's no easy answer to this. I understand that some people place a much higher value on what other people think of them than what they think of themselves. I don't. I place a value not on what I think or what another person thinks, but on how I compare to the values that I consider to be good. And so this concern that she has about not being good enough or not meeting somebody else's expectations, the underlying question that I'd recommend she ask herself is, are their expectations reasonable? Are their views about what is good enough actually good? Because you can spend your entire life trying to live up to someone else's unrealistic expectations and you'll be miserable. But if you just realize that those expectations may in fact be unreasonable, that they are not the measure of your worth or value, you can in fact be much happier. And so this isn't just a simple, you need to develop some self-confidence and value yourself more. It's about looking at what things do we value. Do we value honesty? Do we value truth? Do we value compassion, empathy, loyalty? Do we value right behavior that improves the world? We've talked about this in another sense with regard to charitable giving. If I donate $50,000 to a cancer charity, somebody could come along and say, well, why didn't you donate that to this other charity because it's a bigger issue? Or $50,000 is X% of your net worth. You could have donated $100,000. Or what about this person who only donated $5 when $5 was all they had? And now we're getting closer to biblical examples about worth. When I try to think about what my value is, there's a number of different criteria that I consider. But they are not this is what somebody thinks of me, and also this is what I think of me. Instead, the comparison is with respect to things that I have learned and am convinced are in fact good values. So rather than focusing on living up to somebody else's expectations in order to be considered valuable, I focus on living up to expectations and values that I think are good. And then the people who agree with me, who value those sorts of things, they're the people whose opinions matter the most. Now, this is a video that's going to go up on my Atheist Debates Patreon project, which means it's a patron-supported video. And what that means is there are people who value what I have to say, and they would like to make sure that I have an opportunity to keep doing this and travel around and give lectures and debates and magic shows and everything else that teach skepticism, that teach morality, that debate issues where there's not clear agreement. Does that mean that I value my patrons' feedback more than I value someone else's feedback? No. In some cases, there are patrons whose feedback I greatly value, and it's not based on how many dollars they have contributed, but whether or not we share an understanding of the good values that we want to promote. And so, of course, I value the feedback from my patrons because they're the ones who see a value, are willing to contribute to that value, and are encouraging me to go out and spread and share those values. But that doesn't mean that just because somebody donated money and contributed to something that their opinion or assessment is worth more than somebody else's. There are people who are closer to me, that are family or like family, some even better than family. Some of my good friends are more valuable to me than some of my family members. It's frustrating to people and sometimes concerning that anyone could ever say, oh, I value this person more than that person, because it seems like you're doing something wrong. It's because we've been taught that all human value is equally worthy. And in really what I look at it is there's a base level of value that we should consider across the board for humanity, such that we encourage liberty and freedom of thought, such that we aren't running around slaughtering people, such that we are doing the sort of things that make the world better for everyone. But anyone who wants to say that the person that they are in love with, the child that they've had, is of the same value to them as someone they've never met on the other side of the globe, I think is engaged in a kind of high-level abstraction that doesn't get to the real meat of things. There's nothing at all wrong with caring more about some people any more than there is to care more about your pets than your neighbor's pets or than a feral animal that's not a pet. The notion that parents don't end up having a favorite child is silly. Quite often people have a favorite person. Quite often people have a favorite child. And that doesn't mean that they don't love the other one sufficiently. And I'm sure how we can quantify that love or appreciation. But in Jennifer's case of this concern, of feeling that you're not going to live up to someone else's expectations, there's a part of me that wants to say, yes, you're not. You're not going to live up to everybody else's expectations. And the sooner you get comfortable with that and realize that it's not their expectations that you should be living up to, but good expectations, reasonable expectations. It's like when somebody says, oh, Matt's not smart enough to understand whatever. Well, that may or may not be true, but that's not in any way an argument, or it doesn't demonstrate that I haven't made the case or that I haven't launched significant, reasonable objections to something. If my view on how humans should interact is based on particular ideals, and those ideals are wrong, by all means, let's talk about that and address them. But if I'm convinced that someone has terrible ideas, like they think that white people are superior to black people and they want to have a nation that is free from this, their opinion of me as a person is now dramatically diminished because they've demonstrated that they aren't capable of thinking about these things in reasonable terms. That the values that they're using to evaluate me are flawed. They're not good. And I don't want to be in any way dismissive of the real pain and hurt that Jennifer's going through and struggling with this. It's, hey, I constantly feel like I'm not going to live up to other people's expectations. And I would recommend that if that's something you're struggling with and simple thought exercises about recognizing your value, about making sure you're being compared to good things and not just what somebody wants of you, because that's how con artists operate. That's how people are tricked and taken advantage of, is by getting someone to think that they need to be what you need in order for them to have any value. This is something that goes on in all walks of life, where you basically hammer down somebody else's self-esteem so that now everything about them is dependent on your assessment of them. There is a self-confidence component. There is an intellectual exercise involved in this of assessing worth. But that's not the sum total of it. And if you're struggling with something like this, by all means, I would recommend that you reach out to the Secular Therapist Project, that you find some friends to talk to who are willing to have those sorts of discussions. It's not always easy to find someone who's going to accept you for you. And sometimes they might be right. Sometimes there may be something about you that is keeping them from accepting that, something you need to change to be a better person. But quite often, that's not the case. Quite often, you're perfectly fine and valuable and certainly deserving of compassion, consideration, and love, and yet there's some other roadblock in the way. I don't set out to live up to any individual's expectations. I set out to live up to good expectations, and I try to make sure I instill in myself those good expectations, which is why when I messed up the other day and actually violated somebody's trust, it was literally 2 or 3 tweets, short tweets, that said, hey, you did this and I think it was wrong and I don't appreciate it. And I thought about it and said, you're correct. Those are values that I share, and I violated my own values. I'm not going to beat myself up over it forever. I recognize that, none of us are perfect or always going to be perfect. But striving to be better with respect to good values is about the best we can do. So if you're hung up on intrinsic value, I'll trade you my 1s for your 20s. And once you get over that, because you'd rather not go broke, if you're struggling with this notion that you don't think you're going to live up to be valuable, that you don't think you're going to contribute to society in ways that other people are going to appreciate, just remember that there's a baseline where everyone should be valued and appreciated and given their freedom and respected for who they are. And then there is the sort of higher grades of what sort of life are you living? Is it a life that's deserving of value? Because the fact that someone undervalues or does not value a life that is clearly deserving of value is their problem, not yours.
This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.